Welcome, everybody. Special appreciation to Charlayne, to her husband, Ron, daughter, Susan, son, Chuma, Cece, everybody who's here with the Hunter-Gault family. We're just delighted to have you here. Thank you for being a part of life at Grady and this campus and programming around the Hunter Holmes Lecture. A reminder to you students, Charlayne will present the Hunter Holmes Lecture today at 2 o'clock in the University Chapel. All are invited. Charlayne certainly needs no introduction. We see her on the PBS NewsHour presenting her Race Matters series. We read her many books. We open ourselves to learn from her. And you students have been studying her career, her journalistic journeys around the world, and her historic role in making the University of Georgia what it is today. Much of that success owes to the richness of students who study here, because Charlayne and Hamilton Holmes had the courage, the hope, and the heart to open our doors and enrich us all. We are so fortunate that she chose journalism and Grady as her major. Her work and her words leave an indelible mark on our world. And we're doubly honored today to be joined by the students of our very own Dr. Barry Hollander. As you know, we lost Dr. Hollander to cancer a couple of weeks ago. He was our lovable curmudgeon, a voice of wit and reason, and a constant defender of journalism, real journalism, the kind of journalism we teach at Grady College. We honor Barry by hearing from one of Grady's greatest journalists, Charlayne. Charlayne has generously agreed to talk with you this morning and respond to your questions on her life and career of Journeys to the Horizon, and her hopes for a wonderful fund she and her husband Ron created last year, the Charlayne Hunter-Gault Giving Voice to the Voiceless Fund. The fund's purpose is to provide inspiration and support to students like you who follow in her footsteps and do projects and tell stories that give voice to voiceless people, issues, and stories from Georgia to the wider world. Charlayne, thank you for adding this moment with us to your day and for inspiring students. Charlayne Hunter-Gault.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to see so many bright and shining faces. It's not that early, but it's still morning, so, you know. Look, I have a lot to talk about, and I'm going to try to do it briefly, but knowing that some of Professor Hollander's students are here and taking note of the tragedy in Florida yesterday, I'm a preacher's kid, and I have a lot of faith. So I have faith that Professor Hollander and those young people who were sacrificed yesterday are now ancestors. So I just want to take a moment of silence for us to think about our ancestors, including Hamilton Holmes, who came here with me all those many years ago. So let's just chill for a moment, okay? Okay, thank you. You know, there are millions of people in this country and in the world who do not have a voice about things that directly affect them and their lives. But, you know, this is nothing new. If you read the Red and Black this morning, which, by the way, did a wonderful job in such a short period of time, but I have aspired to be a journalist since I was about 5 or 6 years old. My grandmother, who educated herself after being taken out of school in the 3rd grade to help her mother manage, that's another story. It's an interesting story, but that's another story. At any rate, she educated herself, and so she read 3 newspapers a day. And at 5 and 6, I used to sit at her feet and wait for her to drop the section that had the comics. And I fell in love with a beautiful, redhead, blue-eyed reporter by the name of Brenda Starr. Now, most of you probably are too young to have ever heard of Brenda Starr, but I see a professor over there nodding. And I'm sure Dean Davis has heard of Brenda Starr. But she traveled the world in search of people. Now, in the process, she encountered a one-eyed mystery man who cultivated black orchids. Well, in my process of traveling the world in search of people, I encountered a mystery man. He had two eyes, both green like mine, and 48 years ago, we hooked up. There he is up there. And so my life following Brenda Starr has been simply amazing. As I have embarked on, Valerie, I thank her for this, Zora Neale Hurston's words, Journey to the Horizons. I have devoted, as you heard a little bit, my professional life to finding people who needed a voice. I did that in my first job at the New Yorker. I started as an editorial assistant, but like everybody else there, I had ambitions to be promoted. The guy who sat in front of me had to type, this was the days of typewriters, had to type rejection letters like I did. But at lunchtime, he would work on his poetry, which he hoped to get published in the magazine, and I would work on little notes about memoirs. And eventually, I sold my first memoir. And I was telling one of my colleagues, oh my God, I said, I'm so excited. The New Yorker has bought one of my first piece. And actually, they said, well, what did you get paid for it? I said, get paid? I don't want to get paid. I mean, I'm just happy to be in the magazine. They said, wait a minute. The first thing about a professional you learn is that you get paid for your work, okay? You do not donate it, all right? So that was my first time. Then I went to the New York Times, the NewsHour, NPR, CNN, and wrote two books and an ebook, which is about what they call in South Africa corrective rape, where it's the horrific practice where some men rape lesbian women to correct their sexuality. And so I want to tell you about a few of the experiences that I've had that helped to further my career, but also give voice to the voiceless, and which has made me and my husband so enthusiastic about creating this fund, giving voice to the voiceless. My son Chuma and his partner Cece have arrived. You were announced earlier, so welcome. So I want to tell you just a couple of stories that I have covered in which I feel confident I helped to give voice to the voiceless. And the first one was a trip I made with former President Jimmy Carter, Desmond Tutu, Charles Bronson, and Graça Machel, now the widow of Nelson Mandela. He was among those until he transitioned. That group was called the Elders, and they used to travel the world to trouble spots, trying to shine a light on troubles that were affecting people. And nowhere was that greater the case than in war-torn Sudan, which that was years ago, but at the moment it is still trying to deal with conflicts among each other, between each other. At any rate, at one point, President Carter and some of the men were over talking to some of the men, and Graça Machel was over talking to the women. And these people these Sudanese had fled their homes because of the fighting, and they were in a sort of camp, and they had to be, food had to be taken to them and so on. And they didn't have a lot of food. And so Graça said, well, where do you get your food? And one of the women said, well, we go out over there, and pointed to the forest. She said, we go out over there and scrounge around and search for food. And so Graça said, wait a minute, why are you all going out there? Because it's very dangerous. There were soldiers who, if they caught them, could kill them or worse. And so she said, why aren't the men going out there instead of you? And one of the women said, well, our men would be killed. We would only be raped. And both Graca, the other women knew this, but Graca and I were just astonished that she just said this, like she said, oh, well, we just go out and get breakfast and come back and it's no problem. It was an amazing moment. The end point came when I later interviewed Graca, and I said, what can people, women especially, in the rest of the world do to help these women? And she said, well, in the first instance, they don't have any care for their female problems. So if there are doctors in America or anywhere else who want to come and help them, that would be great. She said, but the other thing is letters to these women from women anywhere in the world, just letting them know that they understand their problems. She said that would mean an awful lot to them. So I wrote that up and published it in Essence magazine. Another time I was in Zambia, and there was a local NGO working to change the practice of grown men, many of whom were gray-haired and old, who were involved in a practice of having sex with young girls, and I mean really young girls, like 12 or 13, who are just entering their womanhood, and I don't have to go into details about what that means. But the NGOs, this was some sort of rite of passage that they were engaged in for years and generations. So the women knew that appealing to these men's morals wasn't going to do anything. So they began to put out the word about AIDS, HIV and AIDS, and they said, don't you know that having sex like this could lead you to having HIV and AIDS? And that was the thing that did the trick. So the chief was someone I went to interview. I think I was working at that time for NPR. And so I said to the chief, he says, oh yes, that's what we're doing now. He says, and he was so proud of, the advancement. And I said, well, chief, let me just ask you a question. I said, did you ever engage in this practice? And he said, oh yes. He didn't think it was such a big deal, but he had been converted now to this new way of doing things. But covering this issue, a lot of NGOs need the help of people to carry on their work. And so I reported on this, and as a result, I think that they were able to bring in more funds to help other young women along with whatever issues they were having. These were stories I did working for NPR and CNN, but long before that, when I was still in college here, I started on this journey. It was not long after I was admitted here that I volunteered to work for the Red and Black. And by the way, I am so impressed with the story the Red and Black did this morning. I can't get over it. It's so professional and in such a short period of time. Anyway, in those days, as you know, I was the only black female here. And so I would go over, and Tom Johnson, who was the editor, welcomed me. However, University of Georgia was desegregated, not integrated, desegregated to a point, Hamilton and me, but the town of Athens was not. And many of the stories that the students at the paper had to cover took place in Athens. For example, the bowling alley was in Athens. That's how I shouldn't tell you this, but physical education was a requirement in those days, and I just wanted to concentrate on the heavy stuff. I didn't want to take physical ed. So I used this is so bad, I shouldn't even tell you this. Well, I've started now, so I guess I better tell you. I didn't want to take physical ed. Just like in high school, I thought home economics was silly too. I wanted to take physics and chemistry and all of that. I never got really good at math. That's why I married a banker. Anyway, I didn't want to take physical ed. So I asked if I could take, I don't know, bowling, because I knew that the bowling alley where the students practiced was in Athens, and there was no way they were going to let me come to the bowling alley. They said, okay, well, you can take physical ed next semester. Okay, fine. Next semester came, same mental attitude, and I said, well, I'd like to take swimming. They did not want me in the pool with the other girls, all of whom were white. I said, okay, we'll wait till next semester. But finally, I think I chose archery. And that did not require me interacting with anybody other than the what is it you use when you do an archery? The bow and arrow. So I eventually got to, anyway, I'm way off the story, but at any rate, because I couldn't work for the Red and Black, I would go home on the weekends and work for a young upstart newspaper in Atlanta called the Atlanta Inquirer. And it was covered, it was at the time of the Atlanta student movement when the students were demonstrating to end Jim Crow in Atlanta. And the traditional newspapers, even including the black newspaper, because there was one black newspaper, the oldest in the country, but a lot of their advertisers were white. So they didn't cover the students either because they didn't want to lose the advertising. So this Professor Carl Holman from Clark College, who was partly responsible for me being at UGA, he encouraged us very early on. And another pioneer, civil rights pioneer, young Julian Bond, who was also a student, but he was managing editor of this upstart paper called the Atlanta Inquirer. So on the weekends, I would go there, and initially, it was a time when the students were trying to get arrested during their demonstrations so that they could challenge the segregationist laws in court. So what would happen initially was that they would go out in the morning, get arrested midday, get released from jail mid-afternoon, and come to Carl Holman's basement and tell me what had happened to them so I could write the story. Well, that was how it started. But then eventually, I blossomed out and got to cover things like the fact that they didn't want to desegregate the high schools in Atlanta. And there was one, Howard High School, where the black students were overflowing. The school was overcrowded. So they had set up something like a trailer for the extra students to come to. I mean, it was funky, it was hot, it was small and cramped. And they had to walk past a white school that was almost empty. So I went, and that was the first story I covered, and I was so empowered by that because I called the superintendent of schools, who is a very big deal. And I said, I'm Charlayne Hunter from the Atlanta Inquirer, and I'd like your comment, the superintendent's comment. She wasn't on the phone. I was talking to her assistant. I said, I'd like her comments on this situation. Well, in a few minutes, she came to the phone. I couldn't believe it. I didn't think she would come to the phone. Well, talk about getting empowered. Ooh, I was very empowered by that. And then I went on to cover other stories that dealt with the effects of segregation on African Americans in particular in Atlanta. I think it was during that time that I began to understand that there were so many people in this, not only in Atlanta and Georgia, who needed a voice, but people all over the country. When I went to the New Yorker, I was the first African-American reporter. And while it was always been a very liberal and wonderful magazine, I don't know if you've seen the last few issues. There was one a few months ago with picturing Dr. Martin Luther King taking a knee with some football players. Usually every year when I was there, around February, there was an anniversary issue, and on the cover was a guy in a top hat and everything called Eustace Tilley. And he was on the cover for long as I was there. Well, recently they've started to change the face of Eustace Tilley, And in this year's anniversary issue, there was Eustasia Chile, a young African-American woman, chocolate-colored and beautiful. So it's always been a liberal magazine that kept up with the issues of the times. But at that time, African-American people didn't have a voice. And so this was sort of like the little ruse I used to get out of physical ed here. I went and started covering stories that were not about the existential misery of black people, but about black people like the guy who owned a bookstore. He's about this tall, he was West Indian origin, and he owned a bookstore at a famous corner of Harlem and it was a little like this. I mean, it was a little like this room and like that. One story up with books everywhere, and writers and all kinds of people would come there because he had the largest collection of books by and about black people in the country. And what made him that was an interesting story, what was in that library. But also what made him interesting was that he used to speak in couplets. And this was the mid-60s, so there was movement to try and, bring black issues to the fore and criticize racism. And so one of the couplets that he used to say all the time was, "The white man's dream of being supreme has turned to sour cream." And I put that in the story, and it ran, and across the street was a famous corner where people as long ago as Marcus Garvey, who had this Back to Africa movement, moved on up to Malcolm X. They had a step ladder, tall ladder, that these people would stand up on and declaim about race and racism and so forth. So I did a story called The Corner. Most of the pieces I did in those days had two words: the corner, the bookstore, etc. But again, there were stories about people as opposed to people with problems. Now, eventually, I got into that a bit, especially at the New York Times. And while I think that during that period, when I went to the New York Times, I opened for the first time a bureau in Harlem, which meant that, again, it was pretty easy because all I had to do was walk down the street and I'd run into a story because the walk-in stories were there. And it was interesting, too, because I had a lot of friends in Harlem. And what I would tell them, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this later on today at the other talk I'm giving, it's sometimes hard to separate who you are personally as a human being from your work as a journalist. But I think I've managed to do that reasonably well, although I do identify with the she-devils, but y'all know what that's all about, so I won't go into that. But I used to tell my friends in Harlem, we'd be having dinner or something, or just lunch or whatever, and they understood that our friendship was at a certain level. But if they crossed the line and did something that they weren't supposed to do, that's when I stepped out of my friendship persona and moved into my journalist persona. And I had to do that a couple of times, not too many times, but I did. And I think I managed to keep myself from being schizophrenic. So, I won some prizes for some of that work, but that was hardly my motivation. My motivation was to give voice to these people who otherwise had no voice, but should have had a voice. So it is my belief, after all these years, that our world would be a better place if we embrace and support young would-be journalists and other students who are interested in being servants of the people at home and abroad, shining a light on and giving voice to political and social and economic issues that should concern us all, given that a long time ago, even before he got so involved in and known for his work in civil rights, Martin Luther King had been a citizen of the world, and he talked about how we were all wrapped in a single garment of destiny. And that is more the case today than ever. I mean, I don't want to get into politics. I could, but I won't at the moment. But what is happening here in America today, the political atmosphere, is having a terrible impact around the country, around the world, well, the country too. But this used to be a country that, for all of its faults, people around the world look to because of our democratic principles. And even though sometimes they got a little bit corrupted, my brother, who will join us later, used to be worked for diplomatic security, and he was one of Madeleine Albright's security people traveling around the world with her. And I was moderating a panel with her once, and somebody was criticizing something, saying America wasn't living up to its democratic principles. And she said, hey, don't you understand? Democracy is messy. And that's why we need citizen participation to help keep it out of the messes that that human beings sometimes get it into. So, to the end of helping our own views, our own reputations, and also helping others appreciate the fact that there are so many of us here in America who believe that we are wrapped in a single garment of destiny, that Ron and I have begun this endowment called Giving Voice to the Voiceless. And there's Ron up there looking very handsome today in his beautiful outfits, including his socks that match his tie and his handkerchief. He's really good at that. That was that wasn't the only thing that, come on in, Susan, here's my daughter. They're up here, go that way. At any rate, that's why we have started this fund to help you, students, give voice to the voiceless, preparing you for your journey to the horizons. Now, some of you, Grady people, have already begun doing that. So this endowment begins with a contribution of our own, which will increase yearly, and which we hope will be joined by others who believe as we do. We've sent emails to every single friend we had saying, please contribute to this effort because we so believe in it. And so it is our hope that within the next few years, we will have raised $500,000 and maybe more for this project, which begins now with our first grant. I think it's already been given, right? It's already given to give voice to the voiceless. And by the way, tell your parents, and if you got your own money, this is tax deductible. So, you know, when I spoke earlier here at UGA for a program called Chess and Community, there were young people who surrounded me telling me about their desire to do this and their wish to follow me on my journey to the horizon. So I have no doubt that we have a very talented pool of young people who are ready to take advantage of this offer. Moreover, I'm confident that their finished products will find a way to audiences that need to hear what they're going to be talking about, because again, we all need all the help we can get to reach people who need to hear these words the most. I've spoken with my colleagues at the PBS NewsHour, and if there are those, and I'm sure now every journalist who goes out there has a camera with them, and some of the best of those are going to be streamed live on the PBS NewsHour site. And so I think as I close, before we begin the questions, I want you to recall, if you don't already, if you haven't heard it, or recall the words of Edward R. Murrow about journalism and about what you can do with it, whether you're a journalist or whether you're just interested, again, in in giving voice to the voiceless. And Edward R. Murrow said of television, but I think it applies to all the things that the media we're talking about. He said, this instrument can teach, it can illuminate, it can inspire, but it can only do so to the extent that human beings are willing to use it to those ends. Otherwise, it's merely lights and wires in a box. Or, dare I say, no, I'm not going to say fake news, so anyway. Hearing the voice of Murrow, and again, meeting the students from all these disciplines, I have great expectations that those who want to give voice to the voiceless and shine the light on the challenges that for so many people at home and abroad, shine the light on their challenges. This is a challenging time, but in the words of James Baldwin, the time is always now. So with that, Ron and I are hoping that our gift will be a small contribution that will help you students bring light where there is darkness by giving voice to the voiceless. Ron, could you just stand up so everybody can see you in your nice outfit? Oh, there you are. So, Professor, what do you want to do? You want to come up here and moderate, or you want me to just ask for some questions? And fire away?
They're good at asking questions.
Okay. Questions, anybody? Yes, sir.
Hi.
And can you identify yourself? Stand up so everybody can hear you.
Hi, my name's Anthony. I'm a journalism and English student, and I also, before I found my way into journalism, I was a poet first. And you've quoted some really amazing, impactful writers, or Neil Hurston and just now James Baldwin, who's actually a big inspiration of mine. And I was wondering if you maybe have any thoughts about how journalism and art, specifically, creative writing, whether it's like novels or poetry, where those things can intersect, possibly, along the lines of giving voice to the voiceless, and how those two things could maybe be used together to kind of reach the same goal.
I should ask my son to come down because he's an actor. You've probably seen him on many commercials. That helps pay his mortgage. He also has, years ago, you're probably too young for this, but they do repeat, what was it? It was, don't do that, don't embarrass. The one you were with Tracy. Girlfriends. He was in Girlfriends. And I just interviewed Tracy Ellis Ross recently after the Golden Globes, and she hadn't seen Chuma in a long time. And in those days, when he first started, he used my name and his father's name, our name together, Charlayne Hunter-Gault. And I knew that she recognized him and hadn't seen him in a number of years, because when he came into the room, she says, "Oh, Charlayne Hunter-Gault," and that was a name from the past. But anyway, you want to have anything to say about that? I think you're really, what was the question? Stop texting and listen. No, he wanted to know how art and journalism and poetry all intersect. And there have been some wonderful articles recently about, well, I just did I do a regular, well, I would like it to be more regular, but it's a frequent column on race and solutions to racism. And one of the people I interviewed was a professor at Harvard, Marcelina Morgan, who, oddly enough, teaches a course in hip-hop at Harvard. And some of the hip-hop pieces that she, well, by the way, she said I was woke. I mean, y'all know what that is, right? And some of the pieces that she pointed out from these rap singers were actually pieces that spoke to the health of women and how you have to be careful when you're having sex. You have to, do all the things that you need to do. I mean, y'all are not ready for that yet, but you will be at some point. And why are y'all laughing? But also she pointed to a Salt and Pepper rap about the same thing, women's health, and how you have to go and get examined and get good medical attention for your, if not for your issues, for your general health. So that's one thing, rap. But I've seen many poems, especially today, and fiction recently, is walking into places, delving into issues that we don't always see in the news. So I think that there is an intersection. Is that right?
Well, yeah,
Stand up, Chuma, so they can hear you.
Hi. I think the most important part of that is that if you're an artist, if you're a writer, if you're contributing either through your journalism or your art, then in this day and age, number one is it behooves you to be multifaceted. So it behooves you, if you have something you want to talk about, you want to get your message out into the world and your art into the world, then you don't want to be one-dimensional anymore, and you don't have to be. There's so many media outlets for your abilities that you can be a journalist and an artist and a poet and a producer and a musician and have some place for your voice to be heard. I think there is intersectionality between poetry and journalism. I'm a director as well as an actor, and my partner is a theater producer. And I'm finding that nowadays, in the last couple of years, women's voices, trans voices, voices from immigrants. My theater company just produced a play that got a couple of awards in Los Angeles about a young guy who, while he was performing, was under review for DACA. And anytime on stage, somebody could have walked in and taken him off stage, and he thought he might have been deported.
And one of the interesting things I forgot to tell, well, I didn't see you this morning until now, but Chuma just directed a play about sex trafficking. And there's a front page story today in the USA Today about sex trafficking. Yeah. And the need to, so I hope that answers your question. Our daughter Susan is here, and she does art. She did a talk yesterday on art and love, and she also engages in issues that are current and also that are inspirational. So, huh?
Voiceless of the homeless. I give voice to the homeless.
Yeah, a lot of her work is with the homeless, and she takes great photographs of homeless people, and they have come to trust her so much that whereas they might go like this for other people, they welcome her. Any other questions?
Hi, my name's Annabelle. I was just wondering what your thoughts are on the intersection of journalism and the internet, because I know that you've been a journalist for a really long time, and like for me, everything I've published has been on the internet. Like I've only had a few things in print, and that's kind of special to me. So I was wondering what you think about the intersection of those, since it's easier for people to have a voice, but also it can sacrifice the integrity sometimes.
Well, as Chuma just said, I think there is a lot of intersectionality. That's the word. I wish they'd come up with more interesting, easier to pronounce words. But, you know, there...
Crossover.
What? Crossover? Thank you. I'm going to talk about this a little bit this afternoon. So if you're there, you're going to hear it for the second time. But if you're not, you'll hear it for the first time, and that'll be it. There are good things and bad things. There are good things about Twitter. I tweet, believe it or not. And yet, I think it was in yesterday's New York Times, not only about Twitter, but about social media. There are good things that can be done with those kinds of communication, but they shouldn't be the only kind that you take advantage of or communicate in. But you also nowadays have to be aware of the intrusion into our Facebook, our Twitter, other social media by the Russians. This was documented day before yesterday in a Senate committee where the head of Senate and U.S. intelligence documented how they have put in under false names, false claims, using these devices. So I think that the important thing is for you to be a good communicator, to make sure that what you're communicating is not one-dimensional, because I know this is the new way of communicating, but don't let yourself be informed just by social media or Twitter, because you will not be informed. You might get a sense of something, but the other thing that bothers me, and again, I'm going to talk about this afternoon, I don't know why these outlets allow people to put up all kinds of stuff under pseudonyms. I think that's really tacky. It's worse than tacky. What's another word for it? It's outrageous, is what it is. Because you can put up your name as Hidden Ghost and attack somebody on the internet. And that gets put out there, and for somebody who's too lazy to read anything else, they're going to take the word of Hidden Ghost, whether it's racist or sexist or whatever, and say, well, you know, Hidden Ghost said such and such. Hidden Ghost didn't like Hidden Figures. I don't like it either, if Hidden Ghost doesn't like it. So don't let yourself be informed totally. Use Twitter. I use it. I used it the other day when everybody was talking about the S word. One night they're talking about the S word, and the next day, I mean, they're being very careful how they report it because they don't want to offend, especially if young people are listening to the news. The next day, everybody on the news was using it in its full S-H-I-T, saying it. So I tweeted that morning, what are we teaching our kids? Because our kids are watching Twitter, looking at Twitter, using Twitter. So there's good things and bad things. And if you want to use it for the good, all the good. Same with social media. But don't let your own self, I shouldn't have said it like that, but I did that for emphasis. Don't let yourself be caught up in a one-dimensional way of informing yourself. Anyone else? Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Rachel, and I was just wondering how you separate your emotions from covering often heartbreaking topics, such as like, well, a lot of topics that are given voice in the Voiceless are hard.
Sorry, can you just say it again?
How do you separate your personal emotions from covering hard topics?
How do I suppress? Separate my personal emotions? I think that some of the best journalism is written by people who have emotion because they put that into their words. They choose their words carefully, but they write with a strong conviction that what they are writing means something. And so don't suppress your emotions. Just use them in a way that is journalistically acceptable. You know, nowadays, I'm seeing more and more, especially in the New York Times, which is one of my sources of information, because I used to work there, but also because I respect a lot of the work that they do. And I also respect, by the way, and bring me back to your question, but I just want to say as an aside, I respect the fact that when they make a mistake, and we're all human, we're going to make mistakes, they correct the mistakes. So to call this fake news and use as an example the fact that somebody the editor has had to talk about, has had to run a retraction, that's ridiculous. They have the guts to say, we made a mistake. I did a piece a few years ago and I made 4 mistakes. As long as I've been reporting, I made 4 mistakes. Part of it was because somebody told me something wrong. But, you know, we ran the retractions. That didn't make what I wrote fake. It just made it written by a human being who every now and then makes a mistake. So,
what about hard news from editorials in terms of separating your emotions in stories that are hard news stories and editorial?
yeah, exactly, because that was the point I wanted to get to. My husband, after 48 years, can read my mind when I start to lose my mind. You know, what was it you said?
I think the question is focused on.
Oh, yeah. The thing that bothers me a little bit is a reporter can report a story and then somewhere else write their own emotions about it. I don't think that's a good idea. I really don't. Now, if that person gets to be my age and decides to write a memoir and wants to talk about some story they covered 20 years ago, that's okay. But I think you have to keep a line between your personal opinions. Don't use your energy and your what else? What's the other word? Your passion. That's the word I want. Use your energy and your passion to write well and dig deep, but keep your personal opinions out of it, unless you're writing a blog and everybody knows that this is your opinion. That work for you? Okay. Anybody else? Yes.
Okay, hi, I'm Lily. I wanted to ask, like, given the current political climate and everything, like with like the war on the media and the White House and everything, what's your advice for anyone that wants to go into that field, whether it be like covering like the White House or covering politics as a journalist or working in politics? I just wanted to see what your advice is on that.
Let me just tell you, all you young people, this is not the first time that the media have been attacked. Watergate, you won't remember, some of you. He'll remember Watergate. You and Nate will remember Watergate, and Valerie might remember Watergate. The media were attacked. The phrase fake news had not come into being. But the media were scolded. And look what happened. They were right. They dug. I don't know how many of you have seen the movie The Post. I didn't think it was the greatest movie ever, but for those of you who don't know the history of Watergate and The Post, it's good. I knew Katharine Graham, who was the first female editor. I played tennis with her. One day we were playing tennis, and the clouds rose over the court. And we said, oh my goodness, we can't finish the game. We're playing doubles. And she said, well, let's just sit down and wait and see what happens with the clouds. A few minutes later, the clouds rolled away. The sun came out. We looked at Kay, and she said, they don't call me the most powerful woman in the world for nothing. The problem is we didn't see that Kay in the piece. But it's a good historical document about the power of the media and the refusal of journalists to bow to the pressure of those they're covering. Don't ever let yourself be in a position where what you have honestly, earnestly reported and believed to be the facts, ma'am, nothing but the facts, don't let yourself be intimidated by anybody who wants to call you out about it, because that's your job. And you say that. This is my job. And I am not going to be intimidated. And history is on my side.
Amen. Amen.